Jon Rappaport. I'm an investigative reporter. I've been working for 38 years as a freelance journalist, writing for publications in the U.S. and Europe. And since 2001, my website has been nomorefakenews.com. And I'm here to talk about the creation of a false pandemic. I've been researching epidemics really now for 30 odd years, a number of them. This is a kind of primer. It's going to be impossible for me to cover in detail the 30 or 35 or so articles I've written on the COVID-19 on my website. So I'm going to try to deliver to you the basics, what will cut through the lies. And this first episode is called How It Started, and we go to Wuhan, China. Wuhan is a gigantic city of 11 million people. It's an economic powerhouse in China. It was there that researchers claimed to have discovered a new virus, a new coronavirus, which eventually became known as COVID-19. I've described in articles the dubious process by which this discovery was done, relying, as I do, on a much older traditional method of purification and discovery called electron microscope photographs, which would be done with hundreds and hundreds of so-called patients side by side to see if the photographs are comparable, identical, if really there are many, many particles of virus in each photograph, if they are identical from or close to identical from photograph to photograph, and if they've never been seen before. This has never been done. Instead, some very fancy laboratory work was done very quickly. It's always amazingly quick in all of these so-called epidemics, how researchers suddenly say, oh yeah, we've got it. Out of the trillions and trillions of potential viruses, we immediately narrowed it down, and we found this new coronavirus, which we've never seen before, and we assume or think it may have crossed over from animals into humans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then you have the discovery, so to speak. But what else is happening in Wuhan? Because you have to understand that the Chinese also immediately said that the number one symptom of this new disease is pneumonia. Okay, keep that in mind, pneumonia. Now, the city of Wuhan and other Chinese cities have incredibly foul air pollution. This is not just irritable, bothersome. This is serious stuff we're talking about. In fact, one review that I've cited indicates that the air above Wuhan contains an unprecedented mix of toxic elements never seen before in human history, from both the early industrial age and the modern industrial age. You don't need a germ of any kind in order to come down with what's called pneumonia. In Wuhan, all you have to do is breathe. But the researchers overlooked this. Well, it must be a new virus that's causing pneumonia in Wuhan. In addition to that, studies indicate that roughly 300,000 people in China die every year from pneumonia. This is long before the emergence of the so-called coronavirus. So 300,000 deaths from pneumonia per year in China would mean millions of cases of pneumonia in China. Nothing new, Nothing new whatsoever. And yet still, everyone is quite sure that this must be caused by a new virus. In any science class in high school with reasonably intelligent students and an intelligent teacher, they would see through this in about 12 seconds. But somehow the press doesn't see through it, governments don't see through it, nobody asks any questions. No mainstream reporters say, well, wait a minute, hold on. You guys in your virology lab, have you looked out the window? Have you seen the building across the street? You can't see the building across the street. I say, well, what do you think is in the haze between? No questions asked, just absolute loyalty and obedience. How is that possible? I will describe what's called the Epidemic Intelligence Service of the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC, as the medical CIA. They are the virus hunters. They are several thousand trained medical professionals. This branch of the CDC, very little known, has been in existence since the Korean War back in the 1950s. They do several hundred missions a year to areas of, quote, outbreak. They are trained, you could say, entrained, brainwashed by their medical training to always look for the virus. Let's find the virus. Where is the virus? If they went to a city with massive industrial pollution pouring out of a plant into the river and turning it 16 colors, and people were dying on the riverbank, they would say, I wonder what the virus is. They, in collusion with other such people in the World Health Organization, also virus hunters, and Chinese virus hunters, collaborate to decide this has got to be a virus that's causing pneumonia in the city of Wuhan. If you were to call this whole episode dubious, you would be underestimating it by a trillion, okay? Now, on top of this, an amazing thing happens as the press and governments around the world are beginning to catch wind of this dubious outbreak in China. And that is that the Chinese government decides, for one reason or another, that they're not going to even try to do a diagnostic test directly for the virus. That's kind of like saying to a patient, you know, I think you've got the virus. And the patient says, well, is there a test? Yes, but we're not going to do that test. Well, why not? Well, because we have a different test. And what is that? Does it test for the virus? No, it doesn't test for the virus. So in China, they decided that they would do CT scans on patients as they were coming into hospitals. CT scans of the lungs. What do these scans show? Lung infections of various kinds, mild, severe, pneumonia-like, whatever. And on the basis of these scans alone, people would be diagnosed as positive for coronavirus and would be counted as cases. So to begin, understand that the largest percentage of so-called coronavirus cases in the world, which would be in China, were all cooked up on the basis of no tests at all, just simply, oh, you must be, we presume you're coronavirus case, or CT scans. That is the overwhelmingly what has been done in China. And from that, very large case numbers have resulted, which of course paints the false picture of, epidemic spreading, blah, 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 blah. Okay? All right. Now, the Chinese did something else unprecedented, quite early in the episode. And this is the key event in the entire false pandemic. They locked down 50 million people in 3 cities overnight. Bang. Never been done before. Seemed to be a tremendous shock felt around the world. Look what the Chinese did. Unbelievable. The Director General of the UN rushed in to say, this is wonderful. We have to praise the Chinese. They have shown the world the model of what to do in a situation like this to contain the spread of the virus, and it's marvelous, marvelous, marvelous. Really, the brutal dictatorship of China locks down 50 million people overnight, and people are popping champagne corks. Well, they are at the CDC, and the World Health Organization, who have been trying to plant the idea of a false pandemic and failing one after another with West Nile, SARS, swine flu, Zika, etc., etc. And now they've got the key in their hands. Now, whether this was all pre-planned or whether it was happening in the moment is another question. But the effect is obvious. The CDC and the World Health Organization, virus hunters, are saying this is exactly what we've needed all along. The Chinese have locked down 50 million people. It's never been done before. They say the virus must be contained. Therefore, everybody's going to believe this is very, very, very dangerous virus, and we have to contain it. The Chinese just broke the ice for the rest of the world, and we can now do lockdowns. Get that through your head. This was the moment. And so it came to pass. So it came to pass. This is how it started. This is where it came from. This is what was done. This was the monumentally fake science behind it. This is what happened. And now I have to add another factor, because this is the biggest con job and stage magic trick of all in all of these so-called epidemics or pandemics. And I want you to really try to get this, because it's very, very important. They create the illusion of one disease with one cause. It must be one thing. That's the biggest stage magic trick in the world, and almost everybody falls for it right away. So, for example, after what I've just said about China and Wuhan and the pollution cause of pneumonia, somebody is going to pipe up immediately and say, yes, but you see, look at where all the other cases of coronavirus have been diagnosed around the world, and you will see many places where the air pollution is quite ordinary, or there isn't any air pollution to speak of at all. And therefore, air pollution could not be the cause of the epidemic. To which I would reply, you're falling for the oldest con in the book, because you are wedded to the idea that this must be one disease with one cause. All the people who are afflicted must be afflicted by the same cause, the virus, or whatever it is. But that is fake, that is false, that is not true. That is the picture they are painting. That is what people always fall for, even the people who would deny that the coronavirus is the cause. Some of them will come rolling in with their own answer to what is really causing the one pandemic, and they will have their one cause. They'll say, well, it's the rollout of 5G technology, or it's this, or it's that, or whatever. They're falling for the same trick. They're assuming right from the get-go because it's a kind of human addiction to fall for it, that it must be one disease with one cause. And that is how they get you. That is how they absolutely get you. Once you've bought that one, bang, you're in. You're part of the club. And I want to read you a brief paragraph from one of my articles here. As I refute the one disease, one cause, I won't even call it a model. It's a fake forgery. It's a picture that is put there to hypnotize populations. Quote, there are people in Wuhan who have pneumonia because of the horrendous air quality. There are people in New York who have ordinary severe flu-like illness. There are people in Italy who have histories of multiple long-term serious health conditions, pneumonia, flu, cardiac problems, kidney problems, made far worse through treatment with toxic drugs. There are people in hospitals around the world who, after being diagnosed with COVID, are dosed with powerful toxic antiviral drugs. There are people on breathing ventilators who are being given too much oxygen and too much pressure, and their lungs collapse. There are perfectly healthy people who are testing positive for the virus because the test is irreparably flawed, etc., etc., etc. There are people all over the world who have various conditions that fit the generalized flu-like, pneumonia-like list of symptoms for COVID-19. And they are being all corralled, like horses in the field, so to speak, into the same corral with the same label burned into the plate above the corral that says COVID-19. These people are actually suffering from a diverse number of different conditions caused by many different factors in different cases. But they are all being corralled under the umbrella term COVID-19. This has happened before many times in other epidemics. It's the same strategy, and you have to understand it. If you don't, you're always going to be trapped inside the picture of the one disease, one cause. You're going to say it's this or it's that, but you're going to assume that all the cases all over the world have the same cause. The diagnostic test for the coronavirus has a tendency to spit out false positives, which will assist in creating the illusion of many, many cases around the world. And I will go into that diagnostic test in more detail in the second part of this series. But suffice it to say, if you make the assumption, unwarranted, that it's the COVID-19 virus, you see, that connects all of these people with diverse conditions together, that is a false assumption. It's not borne out. It's not true. Instead, what you really have is all these people floating about with different diverse conditions caused by many different factors. And the virus hunters and the public health agencies, primarily the CDC and the World Health Organization, by their very definitions and lists of symptoms and so forth, and promotion of the diagnostic test, and case number estimates, and all manner of reinforcing literature and pronouncements, wave a wand over you and everybody else and say, it's all one disease with one cause, COVID-19 virus. And that's why we have a pandemic. And that is the illusion, the cardinal, central, basic illusion. Now, somebody else and I'll quote again from one of my articles, just to give you the objections, because there are always going to be many, many, many objections, and I can hear them, and I get them, and I see them, and I respond to them in articles, because people are not cured of this addiction, which is what it is. Do you see? They're not cured of this addiction to say it must be one disease with one cause just by 2 minutes of conversation. This is a real addiction, a real addiction. Okay, so people will show up and say, yeah, I understand what you're saying. It's very interesting. Not one disease, not one cause. But what about the people who died over here in this city? And what about, how do you explain these people dying over there? And then there's this group of people that suddenly died. They show up in the hospital, they died. So it must be all one thing. What is it? And the truth of the matter is there is no it. And that is the kernel of the problem, and that is the core of the addiction, that people must have an it. They want one, they need one, they must have one overall explanation. So somebody would show up and say, well, what about all these people, who knows how many, that suddenly died in city X, wherever that might be? So I write, but think it through. If people are actually dying in city X suddenly, and weren't in the process of dying for a long time, since they're elderly and they have a history, long history of serious illness, if they were really dying suddenly, then you need to see what's going on in city X specifically, and not assume it's the same thing that's going on in Wuhan or Seattle or New York or Berlin or Milan. Don't make that assumption based on nothing. Is something strange happening in a city X hospital? Is that possible? Are doctors dosing people with highly toxic antiviral drugs, for example? Are they misusing breathing ventilators and collapsing patients' lungs? Did some dangerous chemical recently show up in the environment in city X? Did someone put it there? Who knows? But assuming it must be the virus is unwarranted. That assumption is based on nothing. And then in this article, I happen to say, let's look at a real city X. It's called Wuhan. And then that's how I led with this. I described what's happening in a real city X in Wuhan. And it turns out that overwhelmingly, we're talking about horrendous air pollution and possibly the rollout of 5G technology, because Wuhan is a center for that development. I would still like to see more confirmation on that, particularly at what band the 5G technology is being deployed in Wuhan, whether, for example, it's at 60 gigahertz, which could signal some serious, serious harm. But anyway, these so-called unexplained cases and clusters of cases that people always cite, they don't cite them by saying, somebody needs to go to that city and take a look and see what is actually happening on the ground and why people are falling ill and dying. No. They speak from their addiction. They say it must be the virus. They don't go there and look. They just say, well, I mean, it's obvious, therefore it's the virus, because it must be the virus there, must be here, must be there, must be everywhere. And again, and I'm going to keep pounding on this, because unless people get out of this trap, nothing else matters. It doesn't work. You can't really assess what is happening here with this so-called pandemic or other earlier ones, because you're always going to come back to the sensation and the feeling and the portrait of one disease with one cause. That, in fact, of course, is the long-standing medical model that has been promoted, well, certainly more than 100 years. I don't have the time or space to go into the discussion of the whole germ theory of disease, but suffice to say that the immune system certainly plays a role in all of this, and there are many other factors. And the reductionist strategy, wherever it is deployed, of reducing human suffering to one disease caused by one germ is completely fallacious. To do that in a reductionist manner across the board is a fantastic fallacy. It's very profitable. It makes a great deal of money. It sells. Pharmaceutical combines and companies can come in behind that and develop all manner of drugs and urge and even pay researchers to find new models of one disease, one germ, so the companies can produce more drugs and more vaccines and make more money. Absolutely, no question about it. So we certainly have precedent for this model, but in the epidemic arena, the pandemic arena, it's magnified and intensified to a great degree, and people actually become hysterical about the whole thing, as you can see with the lockdowns. They want people to keep their distance of 6 feet. They want to wear masks. They are quite sure, based upon whatever they see on television, that it all must be the virus. That addiction to that idea is at least as solid, if not more solid, than the most solid heroin addiction. That I can tell you. So I want to leave you with that for the moment to think about. Think it through. Think it through. And I will have more evidence to support what I'm saying here in the next episode of the creation of a false pandemic. This is Jon Rappaport. I want to thank Catherine Austin Fitz and the Solari Report for giving me the space and time and technology to do this series, and to say my articles are at nomorefakenews.com. See you next time. This is Jon Rappaport with part 2 in the creation of a false pandemic. And I'm titling this one The Medical CIA in order to punch up a point that I made in the first episode, which is that the Centers for Disease Control has a branch called the Epidemic Intelligence Service, EIS, and has trained several thousand people since the Korean War to go out into the field, to look for outbreaks, and to find out what's causing them. I call them the virus hunters because that's their training, that's their bias, that's their propensity, that's what they do. And this is an insiders club that is very powerful, the EIS, the Epidemic Intelligence Service. As the CDC will tell you on their website, graduates of this program have gone on to become surgeons general, editors of medical journals, medical reporters and journalists, very important, deans of medical schools, pharmaceutical company executives, and so on and so forth. All of the elements of what I call the medical cartel are covered by the EIS, and it is a fantastic insiders club. They share the same view, they share the same models, they share the same ideas. They believe in the same kind of, quote, science. And so when one of the club would go out into the field and say, for example, we've discovered a new virus, another member of the club who happens to be, let's say, a medical reporter for a major newspaper or television news network would naturally infer that this is completely true and accurate and couldn't be otherwise because they are literally all in the same club. So when people say they're looking for insiders in a given situation, and who are the insiders and so on and so on, I'm telling you, the Epidemic Intelligence Service is a major insider. It's a major club. It links up and networks many elements of the medical cartel so that they are all on the same page. They all have the same information. They all believe in and trust in the same, quote, science, and they all report it in the same way. And so I'm going to give you an example here of how this occurred, how it was momentarily actually derailed and exposed and then was covered up again. I've talked about this before. Some of you have heard me talk about it before. It needs to be talked about many, many times because it forms a perfect precedent, and history does in fact matter. So we go back to the year 2009 and the so-called swine flu epidemic, which was heralded and was produced like an ominous cloud that was gathering over the world, a giant epidemic that was going to destroy so many, many, many lives. And there was the same kind of conversation that occurred on the fringes about, was this a bioengineered entity, this virus, H1N1, that was causing swine flu? Again, one disease, one cause. One general list of symptoms, of course, flu symptoms, but now we're talking about something completely different. Oh, yes, one disease, one cause. The model, the portrait, the sketch, the con, the trick, the piece of stage magic. It must be one disease, one cause. They sent the virus hunters out to take a look at what was happening in La Gloria, Mexico in 2009, where some sort of an outbreak had occurred. That's how it began. It's always nice to see how it began, because then you begin to look through the veil and see what's on the other side of the veil. So in La Gloria, there was a giant commercial pig farm. This is not like your neighborhood pig farm. This is maybe, 900,000 pigs? Yeah, factory farm, as they call them. And on these giant factory farms, they have what are called, and this is not my phrase, feces lagoons, okay? Because the urine and the feces and so forth are permitted to run outside of the interior facilities, and they gather in these giant lagoons, which can be seen from outer space. And then workers spray on top of this foul, disease-causing, let's just make sure we understand that. We don't need virus hunters to come in and say, well, we want to analyze the feces lagoons to see if they might be causing disease. No. If you want to test this out, Mr. Virus Hunter, I will pour you a cup of this stuff and you drink it, and we don't need to analyze what's in it, and let's see if you get sick. Rub it on you. Dive into it. Let's see. Touch it. Perhaps. Who knows? But even more than that, we have the toxic chemical foam, which is sprayed on top of that, which is toxic. So workers were getting sick. Big surprise. They called in new workers who sprayed unknown, but you can bet your bottom dollar, even more toxic chemicals on top of the feces lagoons, on top of the chemical foam, and more workers got sick, and some unknown number died. The virus hunters came in, and of course, what did they say immediately? It's a virus. Now, if you don't find that unbelievable and unconscionable, and criminal, then you need to go back to the beginning of this and just keep listening to it over and over again until you begin to see the crime. It must really be a virus, you see. And so, of course, in one fell swoop, the commercial pig factory farm, that corporation is protected. Number one, they're protected from any liability that might ensue, of which there could be much, believe me. That's number one on the list of why float this cover story. Number two is we have the opportunity to float the notion of a new epidemic. And we're always looking for that, say the virus hunters from the Epidemic Intelligence Service, the EIS, and their brethren at the CDC back in Atlanta and the World Health Organization in Geneva and other places are waiting to hear back from their brethren and sisters about what the finding is down in La Gloria, because this could be a big one, folks. Let's see. And sure enough, it is. H1N1. Man, you guys are quick. Oh, yeah, we found the new virus. Never saw it before, but here it is. Boom. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Fantastic. Wow. You guys are really slick. I wonder how you did it. Not important. All that's important to know is we found it. Here it is. This is what it is. Start spreading the news. Yes, we will. And so their EIS brethren at major media outlets that are the medical reporters there that are part of the same club, and the editors and so forth, there's enough of these people around so that they can influence the direction of a story. It's a new epidemic. Swine flu, 2009. Okay? And so it has millions and perhaps billions of true believers who cling to the portrait that I described in great detail in part one of this, which is one disease, one cause. Not many different people having different conditions with the same generalized symptoms from many different causes, such as malnutrition, vaccine toxicity, toxic medical drug, environmental chemical, industrial pollution, poverty, crime, street drugs, what have you, whatever, fear, despondency, adding in all of these elements. I mean, no. None of that is, we don't care about any of that. All we care about is the stage magic trick. It must be one disease, one cause, and here in swine flu in 2009, they had another one going. Okay. We flash to the summer of 2009, and the CDC is trumpeting the fact that there are thousands of cases of swine flu in America. Okay? That's their job at the CDC. That's what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to report to the press, the public, the government, every week, the statistics on how many cases of a disease or epidemic there are, how many deaths. That's their mandate. That's what they're supposed to do, and they are doing it. They're saying there are thousands of cases of swine flu, except for one thing. They've stopped counting cases in America. Secretly stopped, while still reporting the number of cases. This is not something I just made up. This actually happened. Okay? So listen up, because the story gets really good now. A reporter, whom I subsequently interviewed and published her statements on this, working at CBS News, named Cheryl Atkinson, who was their star investigative reporter, had found this out, that the CDC had secretly stopped counting cases. She wanted to know why. She began to dig in and eventually discovered exactly why. Because you see, part of the process of testing and so forth and so on with all of these epidemics is that the most likely swine flu, in this case patients, test samples, tissue samples are taken, and they are sent to labs all over the country for testing. and the test results are sent back to the CDC. All part of a normal doing business every day. One problem, as Cheryl Atkinson found out. Overwhelmingly, these test samples were coming back from labs with the result, no sign of the swine flu virus or any other flu virus. In other words, the whole thing was a hoax, if we cut to the bottom line. While the CDC was trumpeting thousands of cases out there with the one disease, one cause picture, they had secretly stopped counting, and they stopped counting because the overwhelming percentage of these samples coming back from labs were saying, nope, sorry, not swine flu, no swine flu virus, no flu virus of any kind. Hung by your own story, you see. And we're out there promoting, it's got to be one disease, it has nothing to do with the pig farm factory. It's a virus, it's one disease with one cause, and we're going to test for it, it's all going to be fantastic. And wait a minute, what? Most of the tests are showing that the one cause isn't even there? And yet here we are trumpeting that thousands, we're saying there are thousands of cases of swine flu in America? We must be a criminal. Yes, indeed you do. You must be. You must be. And so Atkinson at CBS proceeded to write an article about this, a serious article. Now, you can bet that the people at CBS News, who, like every other major media outlet, were very busy publishing stories on the horrendous threat of the epidemic and so on and so forth, were a little leery about this story and about publishing it. So they, when she was through, they vetted it 17 different ways and ran it by their lawyers and so on and so forth. And they finally decided, okay, this was one of those times when a little light shone in. And they said, okay, we're going to run this. We're going to put it on our website. That's what we'll do. Okay. And they did. And the story was published near the end of the summer of 2009, maybe early fall. Okay. Now, the next step, and her boss at CBS said, one heck of a story. Most original story I've seen on the whole epidemic. Okay, so the next step at CBS would be to escalate and to put it on the CBS National Evening News on television, which is a much bigger deal, of course, much bigger audience, much more engagement in terms of I'm sitting here looking at the tube and accepting whatever the tube is telling me. Then there are all the CBS affiliates, television news stations around the country, and they could run this story locally. Didn't happen. They were going to do it, but they didn't do it. Instead, they shut it down. Instead, they shut the whole thing down. It became a one-off. Well, okay, we published that article on our news site, but we're not going to do anything else here. Not going to do anything else. You just caught the biggest public health agency, west of the World Health Organization, committing a massive crime, and you're not going to do anything else? No, we're not. We're going to shut it down completely, as if it didn't happen. And then on top of that, no other major media, big-time news organization in the world picks up on the Atkinson story that was published on the CBS News website and runs with it and tries to find out more and continue the investigation. Nothing. Zero. If that isn't a sign of an insider's club, I don't know what is. Because these hounds are always looking for big stories, but not this one. No. This one is out of bounds. This is a hell of a thing that I'm talking about here. Now, there's one more element here which I came across. This was an article published at WebMD, which I've cited in my articles several times, that came along several weeks, maybe a month after Atkinson's article was published at CBS News. And this was kind of a retrospective thing where the CDC was sort of saying, well, things are calming down now with swine flu, and we're sort of looking back and assessing what really happened. And in that article, in fact, it was part of the headline, the CDC estimated that in the U.S., at its peak, there were 22 million cases of swine flu. 22 million. In other words, if you tell one lie and you're in trouble, then just multiply that lie by 1 billion and tell that one. That's the obvious strategy there. So we have a history and precedent of this kind of lying on such a magnified scale. And we also have, as I've just described to you in this sordid tale, an instance where the picture, the stage trick of one disease, one cause broke down. It actually broke down in full view. And if people had bothered to look into it, they would have gone back to the source in La Gloria, Mexico, and they would have seen the giant pig farm. They would have understood what really happened. They would have seen that the whole purported discovery of the virus operated as a fantastic cover story to protect corporate interests in pig farming commercially, and so forth and so on. But that never happened. Not from big-time media, not from the insiders club at the Epidemic Intelligence Service. Now, something similar happened with the Zika so-called epidemic in 2015-16 that started in Brazil. That was supposedly a virus that was infecting many people, but pregnant women in particular was the concern, because then it was suddenly said that these mothers would give birth to babies with smaller heads and brain damage, which is called microcephaly. That's the medical name. And this aroused tremendous alarm throughout the world, promoted heavily by the World Health Organization and the CDC. Here we go again. This is another one. Pregnant women in certain countries where we see a prevalence of the Zika virus are being warned not to get pregnant. It's a kind of a lockdown, if you will, without being physically constrained in an apartment. I mean, if you remember, the hysteria was rampant. In certain countries in Latin America where abortion was not permitted, there were covertly, just to show you how far this went, people who had boats that for a price would take women, pregnant women, out beyond the 3-mile limit and perform abortions out there. Because these women were so terrified that their babies were going to be born with smaller heads and brain damage because of the scare hysteria of the Zika virus. If you want to just get kind of a flavor of the crime that I'm talking about. But there was a problem in Brazil because the researchers in Brazil who had started to say, yes, look, we found a whole new thing here, the virus, they were facing a problem. Number one, the Zika virus had been known since 1947. It was known all over the world, and it never had caused any harm to speak of, and certainly not of that nature. Number two, the researchers admitted before they were shut down that they were only finding this Zika virus in 10 to 15% of the women that they were testing, who had apparently given birth to babies with microcephaly. You see, that was the procedure that the researcher was using to find the cause, the one cause, again, the fallacy, of this suddenly emerging, really, was it really suddenly emerging, condition called microcephaly in Brazil. Now, since they could only find it in 10 to 15% of the women, medically speaking, humanly speaking, in every sense of speaking, they had not found any cause, or the cause, certainly not, of this condition. And in a half-sane world, they would have said, well, that didn't work. We have to go back to the drawing board and see what else we can find out about microcephaly, which I or you or any casual person could have told them in 10 minutes by just looking at medical literature, where you will find the fact that any serious insult or injury to a pregnant woman during pregnancy can cause microcephaly in the child. So again, the fake story, the fake model of one disease, it must be the virus, it must be one thing caused by one thing, is exposed as a fraud, when in true fashion you would have to look for multiple reasons why you have people getting sick in different places. So that's history, that's precedent, that's fake epidemic, that's fake promotion, that's the EIS, Epidemic Intelligence Service Insider Club, trying to pump up the hysteria about a new epidemic. That is feeding into the addiction that people have for finding out the one reason for the one effect that they are sold as a bill of goods every day of their lives in some way or another. That there must be a single cause for a single phenomenon, when it turns out that the phenomenon is not singular and neither is the cause. And that is the case with the so-called COVID-19 epidemic, as I described in episode 1. And if you will carefully see and look at what's happened in the state of Washington, in a nursing home, in Australia, where the trumpeted initial cases were all extremely old and had prior serious medical conditions. If you will look at the statistics, the gigantic number of what are called flu cases every year in Italy prior to any of this that's happening now, and the death numbers that dwarf what is now being reported out of Italy that supposedly resulted in locking down the whole country, you begin to see the absurdity of this whole thing and how easy it is, if you have enough promotion, enough insider agreement, to create the illusion of a pandemic, which is false, because a pandemic means you're looking at a single cause of a singular phenomenon. Because if you admit that you aren't, the whole thing falls apart. Now you have to go to each place where disease and illness is happening on a significant scale and find out what exactly is going on there and try to heal it and do something about it for real on the ground where it is. Not fabricate some story that's going to give an opportunity to technocrats to lock down half the planet. So let's get to the diagnostic test. That's the key, and it's called the PCR, the polymerase chain reaction test, invented by Kary Mullis, who won a Nobel Prize for it, died not long ago. And this is the test that purports to be diagnosing. It's the most widespread test in the world, and it purports to diagnose cases of coronavirus. And that's how you would get your case numbers, which are trumpeted. Oh, we have 50 cases here, 100 just showed up there, and 600 here. And everybody gets into a panic because they believe, again, it's all one thing and it's all one cause. And the cause is spreading, and it could spread to them. So this diagnostic test fails in several ways. First of all, and I have quoted the official sources on this, like the World Health Organization, the CDC, manufacturer of PCR test kits, the FDA, in their own literature, where they make certain admissions that you can see if you read closely. The test result may not show the definite cause of disease. That's almost an exact quote from one of these reports, CDC, World Health Organization. What? A positive test that would indicate the presence of the COVID-19 virus may not indicate the actual cause of disease? Oh, wait a minute. Second, the test can show that a person has the COVID-19 virus, but it's actually a false result called a false positive, because the test is unfortunately reacting to the presence of a large number of other irrelevant bacteria and viruses that mean nothing, have nothing to do with anything, including other viruses from the family called coronavirus that cause nothing more than a cold. Oh, wow. Well, then you get a lot of people that are told they have yes, that's right. They're told they're infected, they have the virus, the epidemic virus, and it's a false positive. That's right. Because the test is reacting on the basis of other irrelevant germs. But that's not disclosed or understood, but it's admitted in the literature. And third, and perhaps most important when you really look at it, I quoted a simple word from a manufacturer of the test kits, who said that the application of the test is what's called qualitative. That is to say, because it is basically a test that amplifies a huge number of times a very tiny piece of tissue from a patient to the point where it can be enlarged so that it could be studied, the test does not say anything about how much of a given virus is in the patient's body. It does not say anything quantitative about the amount of virus. And why is that important? Because in order to even begin talking about a virus causing actual illness in a person in the real world, not in a lab, not with machines and statistics and reagents, but in the real world where people live and they are healthy or they're sick. In order to even begin talking about illness in the real world, in people, you need to be able to show that there are millions and millions and millions and millions of a particular virus actively replicating in their bodies. And the test is not able to determine that. Therefore, the test cannot say anything about whether a person is sick or is going to get sick. And that is the gold standard test that is now being trumpeted and promoted as the test to use around the world for diagnosing the coronavirus. Which is sort of like saying, We have a compass on the ship. This is how we navigate. We don't know anything else except how to look at the compass. We don't understand the stars, we don't know anything about the tides or whatever, and we just look at the compass. Now, the only problem is that a lot of times when the compass says north, it actually means south. We don't know when, but we just know it happens a lot, and the same with west and east. But, you know, this is what we've got, the compass, and so it's a good compass, we like it, and we use it, and we hope that we arrive where we're going. That's about what we're looking at here. Now, of course, the proponents of the test, the molecular biologists and the virologists, who are quite sure that this is a fantastic test, and oh, you must be mistaken, we've been using this test for years, and it's quite incredible, and it's standard, and it's, you know, blah, blah, blah. And it can, in fact, they say, detect the quantity of virus that is present in the body. No problem, we can do that now. We do it routinely every day. This is what they say. And there has been, under the surface, you might say, a debate of some sort and quality going on about this question. And so, because I was getting sick and tired of trying to argue in technical terms when the argument is not really technical, I proposed a test of the test, a very sensible vetting procedure for the PCR test. And as soon as I worked this out, I saw that it should have been done, in fact, this vetting, decades and decades ago when the test was first introduced as a quantitative detection device. But it never was. This test was never vetted properly for accuracy. And here is the vetting process in the real world. You would take 500, 700 patients, humans, people, okay? Real people. And technicians would remove just tiny, tiny samples from each person, tissue samples. Those tissue samples would be correctly stored and immediately sent to a laboratory where the PCR technicians are working, and the PCR technicians would never know who these 500 people are. They'd never meet them. They're just given the samples, and they're told, okay, now what we want you to do with the 500 samples, all very simple, mind you, just follow along here, is we want you to say, which virus do you find in each case, and how much do you find in each case? Because you say you can do that. Okay? Okay. And that's what they do. And then when they're all finished, you go back to these folks in the lab and you say, all right, boys. Now, I want you by the numbers to tell me which patients have a great deal, like a huge amount of virus in their bodies. I say, oh, that's easy. Number 6, number 7, number 34, number 69, number 82, number 107, and, you know, and they list those patients. Okay? Now, what should be the result? When you actually look at those humans, they should indeed be quite sick, because they have, according to the test anyway, huge amounts of virus circulating in their bodies. Let's see. Let's actually see in the world, not in the lab. Are these people that have been picked out by the testers actually sick? Or are they running marathons? Now that's what you would call a vetting process for the test. It's never been done in that way. They'll give you anecdotal instances and so forth. But these people who are wedded to the idea of double-blind controlled tests and all of that have never done anything of the like that I'm describing here in order to vet the accuracy of the test. And conversely, we could go the opposite way. Tell us the people that you've tested samples from who have very, 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 very little virus in their bodies. Let's see which numbers those are. Patients. Okay, let's look at those people. And let's see if they're all healthy or if they're all sick, or some of them are sick and some of them are healthy. You know? Because that would tell us something too about the accuracy of the test. So there is a test on the loose that has never been vetted properly, that is called the gold standard, that is being used in this so-called pandemic, to decide who is a case number, who is infected, who is a carrier, who is got the virus, when the test can react on factors that have nothing to do with the virus, when the test cannot quantify how much virus is in a person and therefore cannot say whether that person is sick or is going to get sick, when the people at the major public health agencies admit that the results of the test may not indicate the definite cause of disease. And yet one more fascinating tidbit that I found in official literature that said basically that the test may be able to detect the virus when the patient has an acute infection, may be able to when the patient has an acute infection, meaning lots of virus actively replicating. Maybe then the test can find the virus. But yet, as you'll notice, the calls are going out for everybody to get tested now. And that means huge, gigantic numbers of people who have no symptoms at all, who certainly have no acute infections, will be tested. When the official sources admit that the test is not really capable of finding a virus in people who don't have acute infections. It's a massive fraud that we're looking at. And the results can certainly be manipulated in order to announce rising case numbers, as they are. This is happening. You test more and more people, and you're going to get more and more false positives, and you're going to announce more and more cases, and that's going to justify longer and longer lockdowns and more economic devastation and damage and destruction. And yet, it's all based on this fake idea that is being promoted that this must be one disease with one cause. And as I've described, it is not. That is a false picture. Okay. Think about these things, and I will see you soon next time for episode 3 in the creation of a false pandemic. This is Jon Rappaport. Thanks to the Solari Report and Catherine Austin Fitz for space-time technology and help being able to present this to you. And my articles are at nomorefakenews.com. See you next time. This is Jon Rappaport, and this is episode number 3 in the creation of a false pandemic. And the title of this is The True Goal of the Pandemic. And that's important. If you're going to build up a fake pandemic, obviously you've got something in mind, quite a few things. And again, don't be fooled into thinking that it's just one thing that is the true goal behind this covert operation called a false pandemic. It's going to be more than one thing. There are many fingers in the pie at different levels, who benefits many different people at different levels. I'm going to try to give you a sense of the largest look at the largest agenda here. But before I do, I need to comment briefly on the thesis that the COVID-19 virus has been engineered in a lab. Could be a high security biology lab, could be a bioweapon lab. Different people have different accounts of how this could have happened or has happened. And in each instance of the story, it involves weaponizing a virus, releasing it, and that therefore the one disease, one cause portrait is maintained, except from a completely different angle of description. And so I have some comments on that. I'm fully aware, of course, that biologists and other scientists are always at work fiddling with viruses and other germs in laboratories. This has been going on for a very, very long time. Now, there is a difference between they tried to weaponize it and they did weaponize it. Evidence for trying is not evidence for success. You can try to succeed at something and not. So there is certainly a question about that, which has to be fully understood, the difference between the two. And so quite often, one set of evidence is substituted for the other. In other words, because it might be true that scientists have tried to engineer or tweak or weaponize the virus, they succeeded. And as evidence, we're presented with, well, look, we have an epidemic caused by the virus. But as I've been showing you in past episodes of this, that is not the case. That is purported to be the case. That is the picture being painted for the public, the press, the governments. But it is not so. We are looking at a diversity of many people who have many different disease conditions from many different causes being grouped and corralled under one fake label called COVID-19 that is being sold. That has happened in every modern epidemic. Okay. Now, there is a barrier, a very significant barrier, to the weaponization of a virus. And that barrier is that viruses are unstable and they mutate very quickly. So even if researchers were successful in creating some kind of altered germ that could damage people, the virus would be changing so rapidly that you would never end up with what you started with, and therefore guaranteed lethality and causing death would not be something that could be sustained, because the structure mutates whether or not the structure was tweaked with or weaponized or whatever, or natural, it mutates, it changes. So the idea of creating a worldwide pandemic with a single virus that has been tweaked and weaponized faces that major, major barrier. But even more than that, and this is where I hope that people will have an appreciation of the subtlety involved. If you want to talk about engineering of viruses, the much more effective thing to create the image of a pandemic would be to just slightly alter, perhaps, an ordinary coronavirus, common coronavirus, to cause a cold. The virus goes around the world many times. It can be tested for, and because of the frailties of the test that I've described in an earlier episode, many false positives will be registered and cases will be multiplied into the thousands and who knows, millions, whatever. So that what's actually done in the lab in the way of engineering is to create an illusion. Because the whole operation, the covert operation, as far as the epidemic is concerned, is to create that illusion. We have millions of cases everywhere. They're spreading and people are dying, and it's all one thing. It has only one cause, and we all have to be afraid, and we have to stay indoors and lock down, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That would be a much more effective and easier technical job of tweaking in the lab. So, with that, let's get to the goal. What are the goals here? The incredible locking down, and therefore the destruction, the economic destruction, loss of jobs, paychecks, people can't pay the rent, they can't pay the mortgage, businesses close, owners go broke, bankrupt. I mean, it's massive. That's there, undeniable. And notice how well major media are keeping that off the front page and off the lead story on the evening television news. Whereas in every other horrific circumstance that befalls people, there are hounds of reporters in there trying to interview the mother who's sitting dazed on the curb after a hurricane and she can't find her children. And some other couple with all their belongings in sacks are walking down the road. Their house has been destroyed. There are reporters there with microphones who want to interview them. Where are all the interviews, the real ones, leading the news with people who have been economically devastated by the lockdowns? Not there. Not there. They're not leading the news. They're not being played up. The word has in fact gone out, and this could not be achieved in any other way. This is one of those instances where there is a media policy across the board in big-time media to downplay all of that and say, we're all in this together, we'll get through, I'll help you, you help me, blah, blah, blah. But let's get to the case numbers and the dying and the ambulances and this and that and Fauci and how much money is coming out of the federal government and the latest press conference and how long will the lockdowns last and et cetera, et cetera. The virus, the virus, the virus, the virus. This is economic warfare against the population. It's a significant percentage of the global population. And the purpose of the destruction is to destroy. It's there. It's plain. It's real. People who are called elite globalists, for example, out of the Rockefeller mold, have had the intention for a long time of lowering the power of economies of certain countries and trying to level out economies. Make governments and economies more beholden to banks, more beholden to other nations' largesse, in order to bring in what I would call a single borderless world that is more or less run as a corporation from the top. Think of yourself as a CEO of a major corporation or chairman of the board, and you see that you have 3 divisions out of 50 that are powerhouse divisions. I mean, they are just way out in front of all the others, okay? In fact, they are so good that they operate more or less as independent entities. They are still under you, chairman of the board, and under your basic corporation, but in a de facto sense, not really. They are independent. I mean, they're just, wow, tremendous producers. So there are several ways that you, as the chairman of the board, can go on this. Obviously, you can encourage that and bring, oh, boy's doing a fantastic job, whatever. You can spin these off as separate corporations and own a huge amount of stock in each one. Or if you happen to be bent on control, in other words, that is the most heavy impulse within yourself that you know about and want to exercise, then you're going to say to yourself, you know, there's something I have to do about these 3 gigantic powerhouse departments of my corporation. I'm going to have to reduce their power and effectiveness because they are becoming too independent, actually, and they are a threat to me, and I have to control them. That's the basic psychology which you must understand in order to understand anything about what is really going on behind this pandemic. If you don't get that, everything else doesn't make any sense at all. That there are people in this world who have accumulated a great deal of money and power and influence. For example, the Rockefeller Empire, the Carnegie Empire, just to name a couple, who have this impulse and need to control. That is primary. And in order to do that, when they see some independent entity that is being successful, tremendously successful, they see it as a threat. You could say, well, they don't have to. Yeah, I know that they don't have to. Maybe even they know they don't have to, but they want to, and they need to, and they do. And so that is really the psychology in a nutshell behind the whole idea of globalism. We must reduce certain nations, especially, and nations in general, so that they are dependent upon us and our banks and our control factors and our loans and our directives and our plan for a new world, which is going to involve a lot more top-down control of everybody. That's what we're doing. And of course, how is this going to play into this false pandemic? Well, in the aftermath, for example, just on the social level, there's going to continue to be suspicion and distance keeping among people. People will not be so quick to come back into relationships with each other. Therefore, more atomization and isolation of society in general, which is always a good thing for people that are bent on controlling populations. There will continue to be lockdowns. Say 3 years from now, 2 years from now, the CDC says it's an incredibly heavy flu season in America, and we've found the hot spots and we need to lock them down. 2 major cities and 1 smaller community. And the federal government says, yeah, of course, to contain the spread. And it happens, boom, like that, and it's all automatic, and nobody really has a problem. In fact, most people are saying, glad it didn't happen where I live. And by the way, let me tell you, I don't know if you were around a few years ago for the real big one, Corona, but that, I mean, this is nothing compared to that. So people are going to become accustomed to more lockdowns. Those are just a couple of the obvious social implications. A lot of people are going to endure a lot of pain trying to recover from what happened to them financially. And there's going to be a lot more medical surveillance. And now we get to one of the biggest items. As I've been trying to tell people since 1987, the medical cartel of all the cartels in the world is long-term the most dangerous cartel, because they fly no partisan or political banners. They claim utter neutrality. We're only trying to help and heal, and so on and so forth. And they do that at times in certain limited situations, like well-applied, good crisis emergency medicine, you bet. But across the board, the cartel itself is actually bent on control of populations and enrolling and enlisting people from cradle to grave along a bleak march of diagnosis of, say, 40 or 50 diseases and mental disorders in the course of a lifetime, treatment with toxic drugs and vaccines, to pacify people, debilitate them, make them easier to control. And now add into that heightened medical surveillance as another key element and factor that has now been added in as a, quote, necessity given the current pandemic and the lockdowns. We will now need to have, everyone, much greater degree of medical surveillance to make sure that people are keeping their appointments with doctors, that they are following orders and so on and so forth. They're accepting their diagnoses, and we're going to be developing technology. In fact, we're already in the process of doing it, finer and finer instruments that can remotely detect diseases and disorders before they manifest visibly and completely, et cetera, et cetera. You betcha. Part of this technology is nanotechnology that will involve the insertion of tiny, tiny wires, so to speak, inside the body, even in the brain. Some will be, say, wireless remote censoring with lots of shaming involved. I'm not saying that overnight there will be dictums released by the government. I'm talking about step by step by step, entree into another world where medical detection, surveillance, wall to wall, is going to be used because we're all in this together, because it's all the community and we have to protect everybody. It's for your own good. We know you'll go along with it. You went along with it during the pandemic. That was wonderful. And now we're just going to make sure, do everything that we can so that it doesn't happen again. Even though it probably will, but we're doing everything that we possibly can. We have to spend more money on hospitals, more money on treatment, more money on diagnosis of every disease and disorder imaginable. If possible, as a sidelight, out of the other side of the mouth, turn the world into one gigantic hospital if we possibly can. This is the direction. This is the twist. This is the added factor into the medical cartel. And it involves high-tech technology. It does, in fact, involve the Internet of Things, which is enabled, we're told, by the rollout of 5G technology. The Internet of Things, of course, makes, so many items and objects which were formerly just inert and there, like refrigerators and stoves and what have you, into little computers that can talk to you and do things automatically, and also, of course, spy on you from 100 different directions and regulate your behavior. We are now talking about entering the technocracy's wet dream. Notice the smart cities in China, the smart cities that they're now building, the ghost cities they've already built. How do you think these are going to be arranged if and when they move millions of people into them, which I believe they will? And they can do that now under the rubric of these cities are much better outfitted to be able to pre-diagnose a coming epidemic so that we can handle this, take care of it, without having to enact such disturbing and threatening measures all at once. People will be better educated, etc., all of the propaganda. So we're moving 6 million people, boom, into this smart city. And to give you a preview of the true highest goal, perhaps, behind this pandemic, let's just look at a sketch of one of these smart cities, for example. Wall-to-wall surveillance everywhere. Every person with not just one identity package, but multiple identity packages, so that everyone can be designated, identified, tracked, profiled in 117 different ways, all with the idea that we are going to regulate and control behavior. That's the whole premise here. That's what we're doing. That's what this is all about. And so you have a social credit score now, which is tied to universal guaranteed income, which we are bringing on board. That is, everybody gets a certain amount of money per month that will allow you to survive. And that is tied to your social credit score, which is an index of your behavior. If you park in the wrong place, if you miss a doctor's appointment, if you cross against a red light, if you talk back to your boss, a million other possible things here, all to regulate behavior, your social score will be reevaluated and your index will drop to a degree, and that will affect your monthly check, universal guaranteed income. Again, this is not overnight, folks. This is step by step by step. We need to surveil more people. We need to have more surveillance. Why? Because look what happened when we didn't do surveillance. We had a worldwide pandemic, and in order to contain the virus, we had to lock everybody down. Don't you understand? So we don't want this to happen again. So we need better surveillance. We need to construct better cities so that we can do better surveillance. And of course, we want to help the people who are economically and financially devastated by the pandemic. We want to help them put their lives back together again. And we have multiple assistance welfare type programs to do that. And step by step by step by step, with new program upon new program, we have de facto universal guaranteed income. We don't call it that, but that's what it is. Eventually, we get to that. This is not tomorrow, but this is the road that I'm describing here. And step by step, drop by drop, boiling the frog slowly, people become accustomed. They conform, as they're doing now during the massive lockdowns. Look how amazing it is that people are going along with this in great numbers, and adamantly so, to the point where there are stories of people who are now involved in a snitch culture, calling the cops because they heard their neighbor coughing, having fights in England in a market, or because other people were not keeping their distance. These people who are now crossing over into becoming fascists on behalf of the government. They're not just obeying the lockdowns, they want to become enforcers. The themes are there to be played upon in human psychology. We want to help you folks. We want to bring along the citizenry to protect them. We want to help you with money, with income. And of course, there's no reason for provocative behavior on people's parts because we're building the good society. So rebels and so on, the only kind of rebellion that we think is reasonable is if we're not helping enough people, by which of course they mean they're not controlling enough people. So yes, we believe that, we the official believe that certain behavior contributes to the feeling of community and certain behavior is disruptive to community. Is that so terrible? Is that really so bad? And we want to reward and help people and encourage people and educate people to contribute to the community. And that's why we've created this new smart city. And that's why you can call it surveillance if you want to, but we call it care and concern. We want to be able to pre-diagnose illness and disorder before they occur to protect everybody. And to protect these people that we diagnose, because then we can bring them in for treatment. Getting the flavor of this? Now, there are a million ways to work this con. I'm just giving you one attitude here. There'll be thousands of studies and after event reports and predictions on how propaganda ought to be done and how mind control ought to be done. And of course, there are new developments in mind control all the time. But to move large populations, and we have now the example before us with the massive planetary lockdowns, there was no significant necessary mind control necessary here except to make the announcements, paint the pictures, claim the cases, look to China as the model. This is the technocratic top-down control model. Look to China as the model because they locked down 50 million people overnight in 3 cities. That was the key. That's what distinguished this from the other dud epidemics that we've recently seen. Everything in its place in the smart city. We have room for you. You have room for us. Everything is planned, controlled. And above all, we have, and this would eventually become the case, and this was discussed in a brilliant book called Technocracy Rising, the author Patrick Wood, he traces the technocracy movement back to the early part of the 20th century in America and the engineer's dream of engineering a world. The politicians are all crazy. We are the people who know how to engineer things. We can engineer society. That was the utopian, naive dream. And then that evolved into various political movements, and it split apart with the onrush of war. But it's never went away, and it's been reborn. And as Pat points out, at the heart is the ability to measure and monitor in real time the total production of energy in the world and the total consumption of energy in the world at any given moment, in gross figures down to the individual, anywhere. And that capability, of course, did not exist in the 1920s, but it exists now. And so in the technocratic movement and smart city movement and so forth, gradually, step by step, this is one of the basic fulfillments of the technocratic dream, nightmare. So a voice in a person's wall in an apartment in a smart city says, "Hello, Mr. Smith. This is your friend. I just want to let you know that your energy quota for the month is running perilously close to the edge. You've got 16 units left, owing to the fact that we had to divert many units to emergency medical centers because we had an outbreak, as you well know. Now, I want to do everything possible to help you not go over your energy use limit or trigger the alarm when you reach the limit. So I'm going to be instituting brownouts and dimming in your apartment for the remainder of the month. I'm on your side." Everybody knows now in a smart city that the totality of energy production in the world and use from gross amount down to the individual can be described, pinpointed, quantified, and regulated and monitored with quotas for every individual. You have an energy quota for the month based upon humanitarian worldwide calculations of who needs energy and who needs how much energy. This would be an ultimate. And of course, it spins out of surveillance, you see, because the voice in the wall talking to you can surveil the apartment and all the devices in it, and you. And why do we need to have such terrible surveillance? Because, well, for many reasons, but as you can see now, we have one big reason, and that is to try to stave off, before they occur, global pandemics like the one that we're experiencing now. This is a key, folks. This is a key. Because many people, if you ask them in the middle of the lockdown whether they would object to surveillance of one kind or another, would say no. And you could assure them that it would only be used for medical uses. And you could try to define what the is and the limits of the technology and so forth, and be very kind of concerned for privacy rights and all of that. You would find large numbers of people saying yes. And so what is used for medical today can be used for other reasons tomorrow. Surveillance. Early detection. Early prevention. Technocracy, Brave New World. The old model is done, folks, because we can see what it produces. It produces pandemics. Think about that one. There's something wrong with the structure of society if it gives rise to out-of-control pandemics. We have to be able to do a better job for the sake of everybody. And we have to take the view not of the individual, not of freedom, not of liberty, not of your vision of your life. That is extinct now. It can't be granted, right? Watch out. It can't be granted anymore because look what it results in. Everything goes out of control and we need more control. The world that has now been built is finished because it gives rise to what we've just experienced, the pandemic. Now, this is going to be sold in a variety of ways, folks. And because what I've given you here in the first two episodes is a primer on the fake pandemic, then you can see how, yeah, this is not just disorganized by accident, because the pandemic is leading into the fake pandemic is leading into the need for a new world, a new society, a better society, a more secure society. And of course, China is again going to become the model because they've got the smart cities that they're building, the ghost cities they've already built that can contain millions of people, and the brutal power necessary to force, in a very short period of time, millions of people into stage one of Brave New World. It is going to be sold step by step. It's already being sold, but now a line has been drawn in the sand. Before the pandemic, after the pandemic. This is what is happening. And after the pandemic is going to be described as we have to build a better world, a world in which disease cannot run out of control, in which we have better pre-diagnostic skills, and therefore we need to be able to watch and listen and learn and surveil in order to do that. The pandemic is going to be generalized as a key shock to the system of the population for which there was a before and an after. You're going to hear it, you're going to see it, you're going to feel it, you're going to experience it in various ways. I'm not saying again, don't mistake me, I'm not saying again that this is going to happen overnight. I'm saying that it's a step-by-step process. We've got to clean everything up. We've got to organize better. Statements like that. What do you mean? If you start to look at the specifics, don't think about the specifics. Just get the feeling of the general, the way you feel that it must be one disease and one cause. And it couldn't be various things all welded together under a fake label called COVID-19. In the same way, yes, we got to be better organized. Yes, I feel the need for that too. We have to reorganize things. We have to, post-pandemic, we have to build a better world. Yes, I'm on board. Sign me up. Don't know what it really means, but I like how it feels. Got an education system that doesn't teach anybody to think. Therefore, learn how to feel. What feel? Yeah, I like this. Some people are going to like better organization. Other people are going to like build a better world for everybody. Yeah, I want to sign on to that. Sure, absolutely. And that's how it's going to be introduced. There's going to be countries where new epidemics are going to break out, and then it's going to be said, we can't risk having these epidemics come to the West or the North or whatever. So we have to help those countries so that they never again will experience this kind of epidemic breakout. How are we going to do that? We're going to better organize these countries. We're going to build better countries. Okay, great. Sign me up for that. And what's going to happen? Well, in the countries in which more brute force can be exerted, suddenly and quickly, we're going to see much more surveillance. Wall to wall, visibly there. Not just covert surveillance, but visible surveillance. And we're going to see lots of new smart devices and so forth, and we're going to see energy quotas, and it's going to grow. The epidemic model, in other words, is a tremendous springboard from which other changes can be made on a gross level in society if you will look at this and understand it. The more that I look back on my own personal career as a reporter, starting in the early 1980s and getting into it really deeply in 1987, 88 with AIDS and HIV, is that something clicked in my mind, and I sensed that this was a model upon that would act as a springboard to sell insanity, basically, if you really want to know the fundamental of it. And that has become increasingly clearer to me over the years as I've continued my investigations of epidemics and other medical crimes. I know there are good doctors and good nurses out there, believe me. But I'm talking about the medical cartel. And this epidemic, pandemic type covert op becomes the springboard for saying we have to do better. We have to organize better. We have to build a better world. And that is the high goal of this whole operation, is to take us into, quote, better world. If you reread Huxley's Brave New World, one of the things that you see, which is not necessarily played up in the book of this technocratic utopia, is that disease is not a problem. See, disease is not a problem. War, disease. War becomes the springboard from which to say we must build a better world. And if you want to see a fantastic movie about that, Things to Come, produced by Alexander Korda. Epidemics. We must build a better world so we don't have those anymore. Whether it's enunciated, clearly articulated, or whether it's covertly implied, that's what we're looking at. And you should be aware of that. And that's what this is all about. That's what, yes, the economic devastation, as I've described, yes, a main cardinal indication here. But even deeper and higher than that is this sensation of, whew, we got through that by the skin of our teeth. We got to shake that off. We really got to shake that off, folks. It's like a bad case of the oozy-oozies, and we don't want to see that anymore. Wow. Now that we're outdoors again, we don't want that to happen anymore, you see. says the patient who's just been released from the insane asylum after horrendous treatment of 3 years, and the doctor looks at him and says, well, Jim, if you stay on the straight and narrow and behave, you won't wind up back here again. And Jim says, you got it, Doc. The last thing I want to do is to be thrown into my little cell and treated by you folks here. And the doctor says, you got it, Jim. Stay on the straight and narrow. Whew, Jim says as he walks out the gate. I'm going to do whatever is necessary not to have that happen again. Okay. That's what I mean by a defining moment. The whole purpose of this pandemic was to create the illusion of a defining moment. The one disease, one cause picture, the one spreading horrible wave over the planet, the one thing, the one defining moment from which there could be a springboard of generalities that nevertheless play into deep-seated emotions of many people to organize better, build a better world. Never let that happen again. I don't want to ever experience that again now that I breathe clean air again and walk in the park and feel good. No, you see. Well, how are we going to do all these things that you feel we need to do? Well, we need to be smarter. We need to have smarter. We need to install smarter. We need to have all of this wonderful technology that we've developed, and here's more propaganda, turn to the use of helping people and making people safe. Safe, 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 safe. Okay? And smart city is the way to go. Smartening up our cities and building new smart towns and cities. That is the future. Now, you could say logically, well, you know, when I try to infer from pandemic, this, that, the other thing that you're saying, to smart cities and towns, I don't necessarily see all of the logical links that the pandemic implies that we have to have these smart cities. But you see, they don't care about that. All they want to do is to create a bridge of suggestion along which most people, or enough people, will want to travel into the smart world to avoid the dark world of the pandemic. And all manner of imagery and suggestions will be deployed to remind people of the dark world and the new shining world. And the technocratic world is a world of slavery, make no doubt about it. And yes, we could get into many factors about genetic alteration and all kinds of nanotechnology and this and that and the other thing. And yes, they're all extremely important. But I just wanted to give you the core that runs through all of that so that you see it and understand. This is a defining moment because there are people who want it to be, and they're going to use it in this way. The technocratic world is a world of control, made to look comfortable, made to look pleasant, made to look much improved over the dark world, as long as people behave, as long as people simply do what they're supposed to do. And when you put it that way, most people, or many people anyway, will say, well, now that I think about it, that's kind of what I do now. So why wouldn't I want to do this if it's easier, more pleasant, and safer? See, we're already breeding, so to speak, many, many people who would be comfortable in that smart world, that technocratic, brave new world. But this pandemic illusion makes, the before and the after. The defining moment, The dark before, the light after. Okay. Where does freedom come in here? Freedom is the key. Freedom, liberty, individual imagination, creativity, vision, what your life, your future is, remains the key. Your decisions. Freedom never goes away. The future never goes away. Your future, the future you imagine and create, the power that you have to do that. Whether you want it or not, like it or not, it's there. And no matter what kind of world is being laid out for us, there is still this other thing that stands outside everything that I've described here, which is your creative power, your imagination, your vision of the best thing that you want for the future in your terms. The highest values, the highest, greatest, most thrilling creation of your own. That is not part of the smart anything, not part of propaganda anything, not part of virus anything, not part of fear anything, not part of people selling fear porn anything. Nothing to do with that. It's your power. It's there, believe me. For more details on everything I've been talking about in these episodes, you can go to nomorefakenews.com, Solari.com. I want to thank heartily Catherine Austin Fitz for the time, the effort, the space to do this series. And thank you very much. This is Jon Rappaport. This was a primer, the basics on the creation of a false pandemic.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a real pleasure to welcome to the Solari Report Mary Holland, who is the Vice Chairman and General Counsel of the Children's Health Defense. She has a very impressive resume. She's a former research scholar and director at the graduate lawing program at the NYU School of Law. She taught at Columbia Law, worked in international public and private law after clerking for a federal district judge in the Southern District of New York. She has written extensively on vaccine law and policy and is the co-author and co-editor of two books, Vaccine Epidemic and HPV Vaccine on Trial, Seeking Justice for a Generation Betrayed. She has testified to retain or expand vaccine exemptions in California, West Virginia, Maine, and Vermont legislatures. She's appeared in several documentaries and programs on vaccine issues. She's chair of the Advisory Board of Health Choice and a member of the advisory boards for the Elizabeth Burt Center for Autism Law and Advocacy, the Auto Sprecht School, and Action Play. I want to give special thanks to a very special subscriber who is knowledgeable in this area and made it possible for us to arrange this Solari report. If you look at what Children Health Defense is doing, they are the diamond drill bit of trying to make things go right in this area. Before I bring Mary in, I just want to read a quote I found from her recently that I just love. She says, "Once I learned about the extreme liability protection that industry and healthcare providers enjoy and the suppression of accurate science and information about vaccine risks and injury, I understood the need for immediate, radical, systemic change. I have been devoted to that change ever since." So, Mary Holland, thank you so much for joining us on the Solari Report.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor.
It's perfect. Immediate, radical, systemic change. I couldn't agree with you more.
I've forgotten that quote candidly, but yes, I still wholeheartedly endorse that. And it's possible that I said that as long as 20 years ago.
Really?
This is a serious problem that's, only getting worse. I've been involved in this area for about almost 20 years. Well, about 20 years. And, frankly, there's been a movement around no mandates and around individual choice around vaccines, literally since they were first introduced in the United Kingdom, if not before. When Edward Jenner came up with the cowpox solution for smallpox, it ended up there being riots in the UK, and that's where the word conscientious objection comes from.
Right, I remember
smallpox mandates for children. So this is not a new issue, but because the vaccine schedule globally, and particularly in the United States, has become so frequent and such a burden on, infants and young children, although there's plans to expand it to all adults, but it's so burdensome that this issue has become much, much, much more intense.
Wait, so tell us the history of vaccine exemptions in the United States. What is the history, and then talk about the mandates and why it's under assault?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So smallpox was a very serious infectious disease in the 1700s and 1800s in the United States. When it would sort of go through as a wave, it was respiratory illness and people would die. Not, every other person, but, it was a significant death toll and a permanent disability toll. And so already in the 1700s, there were questions about mandates. And the law would go in either direction, and it was more or less handled at local levels. But the landmark case for mandates is a 1905 case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. And the U.S. Supreme Court decided, there was no written dissent, although there was one dissenter. They decided, yes, a state in the context of imminent harm from infectious disease that has gone through the legislature by law and that does not discriminate against any particular group without basis, can be upheld so long as there are medical exemptions where vaccinating somebody would be cruel to the ultimate extent, i.e. would be likely to cause severe injury or death. So in 1905, they said mandates are okay. And then a little bit more troublingly, in 1923, without any real rationalization, a case came back to the U.S. Supreme Court that said, well, can we have a preemptive mandate for children in school against smallpox? And really, without much reasoning, the court said, yeah, based on Jacobson, no problem. We're going to let you have mandates for schools, preemptive mandates, again, for smallpox. So that was kind of where things rested. But in the 50s and the 60s, we started to see a major ramp up of vaccines. We started to see not only a polio vaccine in the 50s, but then measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis by the 60s, and that they were widespread. And by then, the legal infrastructure was in place that states could mandate this stuff and require it. And so, Catherine, 48 states, starting in the 60s, said, that goes too far. It's a bridge too far. There are religions that overtly say no vaccination, like Christian Science and like Jehovah's Witness, no intervention with the blood, nothing in the body. But there are other people who just say, that's just not my religion. I just don't believe that's the way to prevent disease. So 48 states, until very recently, had religious exemptions. And at its heyday, about 20 states had what were called philosophical exemptions, meaning you could say no for any reason. It didn't have to be a religious reason. And in the last 10 years, as this issue has become more hot, more and more people have been asserting exemptions. And I think the pharmaceutical industry, frankly, kind of sees the writing on the wall. And so really starting in 2015, and a little bit before that, the seed was planted in California to get rid of religious and philosophical exemptions. And so there has been a concerted, massive effort since 2015 by the pharmaceutical industry and by the medical associations and medical institutions and front groups, essentially, for the vaccine program, like Vaccinate Your Family or the Immunization Action Coalition, to take away what they call, quote unquote, non-medical exemptions throughout the country. So that's already happened in California. It's happened in Maine, although it hasn't taken effect yet in Maine, and it's already happened in New York. That means religious or philosophical. But the most frightening thing, Catherine, is when they say they're taking away non-medical exemptions, what has happened in California and New York, and California and New York, California and Maine haven't fully gone into effect yet. But what they really mean by that is de facto they're taking away medical exemptions too. And what they've put in place in New York, where I'm in New York, and so I know New York best, there were some emergency guidelines that the Department of Health adopted in August 2019 that became permanent on December 31st, 2019. And those guidelines say the only basis for a medical exemption if somebody has anaphylaxis, i.e. they can't breathe and they nearly die, or they have documented brain injury. And even in those cases, that would be an exemption for that specific vaccine. Let's say for a DPT shot, it would not exempt you from a meningitis vaccine. So de facto, medical exemptions by treating physicians in New York are now reviewable by the Department of Health. And the Department of Health, through a bureaucrat who has never examined a particular child, may say, no, I disagree with the neurologist who says that this child is at risk of brain injury from the next vaccine. I deny their exemption. And so we have hundreds of children in New York State whose treating physicians have said there is a medical necessity that they not be vaccinated, and yet the state has said, no, you have to vaccinate. No normal, loving, responsible parent will put their child in harm's way that way. And I believe, and we're seeing some evidence of this, thankfully, that's really not even what the precedent says. Jacobson versus Massachusetts, over 100 years ago, says you cannot vaccinate an individual where it would be cruel to the ultimate extent to do that. And so we've gotten 2 wins so far in New York State of children with special needs who are being denied their medical exemptions. And in both cases, judges have reinstated. There's actually 3 cases right now in New York, and there will be future cases around this issue. And there's also, very interestingly, a bill in New York to take away this notion that non-treating physicians can review a medical exemption and deny it. There's a bill that's been introduced in the Senate in New York, and we expect a companion bill in the Assembly, and we're hopeful that that this year, that this session, we will go back to the precedent that says you must have a medical exemption for people who are at real risk of being injured. But in my view, after World War II, when the world adopted a standard that said there can be no experimentation on humans without prior free and informed consent, which means you have legal capacity. It means there could be no duress, no fraud, no coercion. That should have ended mandates globally for vaccines and for everything else.
Right.
And since that time in 1945, there's been an expansion from just experimentation to treatment. And so the UNESCO Declaration of 2005 says that you have to have informed consent for preventive medical interventions. That means you have the right to say no. Consent means you have the right to say no. And many advanced countries with excellent health metrics, Japan, Scandinavia, Germany, up until recently, Spain, other countries, they have no mandates. UK, they have recommendations, but they have no mandates. And what we're starting to see now, not only in the United States in this trend toward mandates, but globally, we're seeing this greater level of coercion. And my reading of human rights law and of US law is that this is unlawful because we have adopted as the hallmark of modern medicine prior, free, and informed consent. And that means you have to have legal capacity and you have to have the right to say no. And we're seeing erosion of both of those things, that it's free consent and erosion that you have to have legal capacity. And we can talk more about that.
Well, I remember in high school having literally the Nuremberg Code kind of beaten into us. And, we were really taught to believe that a society that would violate those was abhorrent, shocking, appalling. And what has most amazed me about some of the vaccination policies and the mandates is the extent to which we seem to have just sailed across that line without thought or discussion. And I can't, it's hard for me to fathom that.
I'm with you, Catherine. It's hard to fathom. It's very clear to anybody with a moment's thought and reading about this that these are extremely serious medical interventions, all of which carry the potential risk of death. They like to say that the risk is 1 in a million. There's no evidence for that. The risks are far higher than that. But all you have to do is, on the internet, look up a product insert for a polio vaccine or for a diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis. I mean, there's, 50 different medical conditions, typically including death, that are listed on the product insert. And so the propaganda rolls on. Vaccines are safe and effective. Vaccines are safe and effective. But, when you look for evidence of this, it's just not true. I mean, all you have to do is look at what the manufacturers say to ensure that they continue to be liability free. We should talk about that. They list the things that people report to them are adverse events after vaccination with this vaccine. Now, they go to great lengths to say this isn't proven and we never go back and test, and this is a sample size of unknown number. But these are reported adverse events from this vaccine. I don't know how you can say that somebody shouldn't have the right to say, no, I'll take my risks. I'd really rather get the mumps than die. I mean, it's just, it's silly. It's just silly. I mean, this whole debate on a certain level is just so silly because obviously the reason that in 1986, Congress passed the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act to protect manufacturers from liability is because people were being severely injured, and some of them were winning large judgments against manufacturers. So commonsensically, you'd say, gee, we really need to make vaccines safer rather than, gee, we really need to give manufacturers liability protection so they can keep making dangerous vaccines. But what happened, and so there's language in the 1986 Act, we're going to give liability protection to the doctors, we're going to give liability protection to the manufacturers, but they must make vaccines safer, and they must come and report to Congress every 2 years about how they're making vaccines safer. Guess what? Have they ever come to Congress to tell them how they're making vaccines safer? Not once. And that we have a judicial decision on that, showing there's a judicial notice that the manufacturers have never come to Congress to report how they're safer. And indeed, I think there's some very good empirical work. There's a wonderful economist / statistician Gail DeLong, who's done a study called Delitigation. And she shows, based on the available data, that those vaccines that have been added to the federally recommended schedule for children since 1986 have a higher reported injury rate than those vaccines that were adopted before delitigation.
I don't know if you watched the vaccine summit that was in Switzerland in December.
I've watched significant parts, not the whole thing, but it was quite a summit.
I only watched sort of excerpts. I'd say I watched maybe an hour, so I'm sure you saw more. But what I saw was that not only was the pushback coming from the medical practitioners and the parents, but you had people with program responsibilities in the different countries pointing out that there was no safety studies for. I remember, I think there was a fellow from Nigeria basically said,
Right.
There's no safety studies to say that once you put all these different vaccines in one small little body, that cocktail is safe.
Correct. It's an extraordinary summit that if you go to the World Health Organization's Global Advisory Committee on Vaccine Safety and you watch their Vaccine Safety Summit from early December, it is truly shocking. It is truly, truly shocking because behind closed doors, although there was a camera in the room, they say exactly what parents are saying the world over.
Right.
There's no proof that these vaccines in combination are safe. They have not tested the ingredients individually. They admit that they don't want to put adjuvants in vaccines, but they don't work if you don't put this sort of booster, which used to be mercury. It's now aluminum. It's a known neurotoxin. They are,
right.
I thought they essentially admitted that sudden infant death syndrome is often a vaccine reaction, not so called. They admit that when people study on the internet what to do about vaccines, overwhelmingly 500% more people go to decide not to vaccinate than to vaccinate. They said that the label anti-vaxxer, which has been used now for 20 years at least, is pejorative, and they have to stop using it because people are, they don't appreciate it. And they really said they're losing the physicians and they can't afford that the physician front line is wobbly and they can't afford that level of distrust in the program. So in essence, they admitted that the program is in trouble, and for good reason. And one of my favorites is the sort of the social kind of policy person is saying to the group, we need more science. We can't keep rolling out the same old retreads. We have to show them that it's safe. And unfortunately, you sit back and you say, good luck with that.
There is no science.
Good luck with that. There is not. And the science that they haven't done, Catherine, the study that we've been asking them to do for at least 20 years, if not longer, show us the prospective cohort study of unvaccinated children versus vaccinated children, and show us that those vaccinated children are, wildly healthier than the unvaccinated. They've never produced that data. And you know what? It's absolutely likely that they've looked at that and they know that they can't show that the vaccinated children are healthier. On the contrary, the vaccinated children have all of these side effects that you would predict from hypervaccination. They have autoimmune issues and they have neurological issues. And so they can't produce that science. And that's really what is now becoming evident. They can't produce the real science because it doesn't exist. So they keep doctoring studies, and even, the editors-in-chief of the New England Journal and the Journal of the American Medical Association, they say half of the stuff in our journal isn't true. They say there's undue influence by the pharmaceutical industry. But even they can't doctor studies sufficiently to really make the case that vaccines are what they claim them to be, safe and effective. And so then we see these extraordinary efforts at suppression. So I just was reading an article yesterday, there's serious discussion in the United Kingdom about criminalizing speech that is considered anti-vaccine in print. I mean, this is the kind of things that are now being discussed, right? And in a place like New York, So children have been thrown since June. Children who had religious exemptions have been thrown out of school. They have been stigmatized remarkably. They have been truly stigmatized as if they were disease-ridden, which is an absolute fabrication. And this is, I don't even know where my train of thought is, but this is crazy, right? This is now a new form of segregation,
Right.
and it is based on nothing. It is the same kind of pseudoscience as eugenics, and there's a link there actually, but it is pseudoscience. There's no evidence that these children are bringing disease and somehow infecting the vaccinated, who are supposed to be protected anyway because vaccines are safe and effective.
Yeah, so if unvaccinated children can infect them, they clearly don't believe in the efficacy of their own vaccinations.
Right. Clearly. I mean, it's such a crazy notion. It's like all these kids have shields, right? And then you bring in a kid with no shield, and that's the child that is somehow the aggressor. I mean, it's crazy.
So let me ask a question, because about 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I would have said if you met a very well-educated, intelligent person, they just couldn't believe that the reality of vaccinations was so different than what they'd been led to believe. So you have an official story, and they just couldn't believe that the gap between reality and official reality was that huge. Now what I see, because of the explosion of sort of the chronic, an epidemic of chronic disease in American children, now what I see thousands of highly educated and intelligent people who have come to the logical conclusion that the gap between reality and official reality is as extensive as it is. And to me, that's a real change. It's almost as though we've hit a tipping point.
Yes.
Is that your impression?
I think we're approaching the tipping point, Catherine. So I think what we're seeing globally is a level of protest that we haven't seen in the last probably about 100 years around vaccines. So in the United States in the 1800s, there were riots about compulsory smallpox vaccines because they were super dangerous, right? Some people said, no, I'm going to take my chances. I'm not going to take your dirty, your contaminated smallpox vaccine. So we're reaching that tipping point. So I was in New Jersey 2 weeks ago. I was in New Jersey in December and also in January, where crowds of thousands of people, many with their children, some grandparents, all people from all walks of life, from all racial backgrounds, of all religions, were gathered outside the legislative buildings and were chanting and making noise and protesting and giving cover to those legislators who would not sign on to a repeal of the religious exemption in New Jersey. And it's particularly significant because New Jersey is the home of, in the United States, it's really the state that has the highest concentration of the pharmaceutical industry. Right. So I think we're seeing that there. There's a huge rally planned for Munich. So Germany, the homeland of the Nuremberg Code and the homeland of what were atrocious, medical experimentation on human subjects during the war, they masterminded them. They have just introduced their first mandate since World War II, and that was a mandate for measles, and that's due to take effect in March. And there will be thousands and thousands of people congregating in Munich, March 21st to 2nd, to protest that. And I don't think we've hit the tipping point yet. Sadly, I think that propaganda works. That's why, industry and government do it. And I think a lot of highly educated people, particularly people in the medical establishment, sadly, really believe in the safety and efficacy. I think once you start to take it apart for people, why is there this liability shield? How is it that unvaccinated children are the vectors of disease? I think when you take it apart, you can kind of make headway, but this is a long embedded idea. And the notion of protecting children from, discomfort and disease it's not a bad idea. it's not a bad idea at all. It's just that the way we're going about it clearly is, to my mind, clearly is causing more harm than good. The chronic health epidemic in American children is horrifying. 54% of American children have some kind of chronic disability. 1 in 5 has some kind of learning disability or neurological issue. 1 in about 40, and it may be even more than that, has autism. These are really serious health conditions. And, speaking of the money, in essence, what we see, query whether this was the intent, but we know that vaccines cause autoimmune and neurological disorders disproportionately. And what are these chronic childhood epidemics that make lifelong customers for pharma? They're autoimmune conditions and they're neurological conditions. So, this vaccine program, whether intentional or not, is leading to not just the profits on the vaccines, it's leading to profits indefinitely, 10 times greater, 20 times greater than whatever money they made on the vaccines themselves.
Right. I remember I was working with a reporter in the 90s, and we did this fabulous chart because I was encountering in Tennessee teachers who were being put under tremendous pressure to say that a child was ADHD so that they could put the child on drugs when, in fact, the teacher didn't feel that way. But they were working hard to get as many kids on the Ritalin and these other drugs. So I worked with this reporter to do a chart to show you how much the pharmaceutical company's stock would go up for every child they got on Ritalin. And it was astonishing. I mean, you're talking about major improvement in the market capitalization for that company of these programs to dramatically increase the number of kids on Ritalin, because it's an annuity. It's basically, you get them on and then it's for life. And that's not even counting, what then gets added. So now tell me, Mary, when you were talking with legislators in the different states you've been working with, when they argue against your position, when they come out for the pharmaceutical company position, what do they say? What are they most concerned about?
So their first response is, we believe the doctors, right? Doctors and scientists are trained in this area, and there are legions of physicians who are telling us that these products are safe and effective for all children. And so, they're telling us this is the best way to prevent infectious disease. Then, sort of almost a little bit at odds with that, they say, but we know that there are some immunocompromised children. We know that there are some children who are on chemotherapy, for instance, because they're being treated for childhood cancer, and those children can't be vaccinated while they're on chemo. And so we have to have everybody be immune from getting these diseases because of those immunocompromised children. And then their third major argument is the theory of herd immunity, and the theory that if everybody is vaccinated, even though they will admit that not every person who gets a vaccine will in fact become immune, if everybody's vaccinated, then we have our best shot at protecting the community from having an outbreak of measles or mumps or whatever it is, pertussis. And they call it, sort of in a more friendly way, community immunity. Those are the primary arguments that they use.
So we see more and more parents and more practitioners objecting. Why is their voice not effective? Because it's very, very strong.
Well, it's becoming more effective, Catherine. So in New Jersey, in pharma's home territory, twice now, families have been able to push back and keep that from happening. And so Connecticut's legislature is starting its session on Wednesday. And I think there's a lot of activity that's planned in Connecticut, and there's hearings planned in Connecticut for February 19th. There's a referendum in Maine that's going to take place in March to decide whether or not the repeal of the religious exemption should go through. It's like a plebiscite. They have that law in Maine. And there's a lot of activity in California. There's litigation going on in California. There's litigation going on in New York. So I think what we've seen is that the states where these repeals have had most traction or gone through are states that are a trifecta, right? They have one party control of the whole state. Basically, in states where there has been two parties, the bills have not gotten so far.
Has there been any interest or concern in the bar or the legal community that you have a basic violation of the Constitution or the Nuremberg Code? And so they may not be particularly interested in vaccination, but a violation that is this sort of extraordinary threatens many, many different areas.
Right. Well, I think we're starting to see civil rights lawyers understand the issue more. So, for instance, in New York, a civil rights lawyer who had worked on segregation in housing and had worked on criminal defendants' rights for many years, he understood this issue that the repeal of the religious exemption was an affront to any concept of civil rights. This is kind of a new form of segregation against healthy children. So we've seen lawyers starting to step up, but it's surprising. I think there has over time been this carve out around vaccines that is extraordinary to you and me, but somehow it's been a creeping concept that, well, this is a carve out and it's okay to have coercion for vaccines. It's no problem. I don't know where that idea comes from, but honestly, but that has been somehow accepted with the rhetoric that, well, they're safe and effective for everybody. I mean, when you think about it, is there any ingestible or any medication that's safe and effective for everybody? I don't know of it. It's not milk. It's not wheat. It's not penicillin. It's not aspirin. I don't know any drug or any food, for that matter, that is safe and effective for everyone. And yet that's the rhetoric that still flies when it comes to vaccines.
Well, if you look at let's just look at the money for a second. If you look at decades, the extraordinary amount of the profits that are being generated by the healthcare industry and by pharmaceutical companies, and how much of that rolls into what I would call as a kickback scheme for political contributions and other forms of income to people in government and politics. And it was your colleague, Mr. Kennedy, who educated me to the fact that the CDC has got the ultimate conflict of interest. They're making money from their patents and their own financial interest in this, in vaccination. So you have an extraordinary compromising of government, politicians, doctors. And then in addition, if you look at the extent to which pharmaceutical and drug ads support the media industry, the conflicts of interest are very, very significant and been going on for a long time.
Right.
And when everybody's sort of on the dole, if you're running a kickback scheme that is this extraordinary and this corrupt, at some point you don't want to admit what you've been doing. It's very hard to roll it back.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, it reminds me in some sense, I spent a lot of time in the Soviet Union, and I sort of came to understand in some ways how it worked for a long time, but after 70 years it collapsed. And the party was everywhere, right? The party was everywhere. It was in the institutions, it was in the schools, it was in industry, it was the government. The Communist Party had to be everywhere. And ironically, although the pharmaceutical industry is not the only dominant industry in the Western world, it is a very, very dominant one, and it has unique access to government. It really, through departments of health and through immunization national programs, it has unique access to governments. And you're right, so the media is 70% funded by the pharmaceutical industry. It's not just the CDC that holds patents. For instance, the National Institute of Health. I did a deep dive with colleagues on the Gardasil vaccine. They hold the patent for the Gardasil vaccine. We know that Gardasil is the second highest earner for the U.S. government from its patent royalties, and yet it's under the same umbrella, Health and Human Services, where they're supposed to decide who's been injured by Gardasil. I mean, it's an extraordinary conflict of interest, and literally the head of the Autism Interagency Coordinating Committee back in the day, they had authorized a tiny amount of money for federal doles, $5 million, to investigate whether vaccines caused autism. And the guys, he defunded that, the head of it, who at the time was the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, saying this would be a conflict of interest for us. We recommend all these products. It would be a conflict for us to fund science that might be helpful to plaintiffs in the injury compensation program. So, I mean, there is an explicit conflicts of interest here.
In our 2019 annual wrap-up, I put up, and I at the time I said, I think this is one of the greatest political speeches of the decade. I put up the speech that Robert Kennedy gave coming out of the California legislature after they'd essentially lost. And one of the things he said, and I thought this was absolutely chilling, he said that one of the legislators had said to him, "If you keep this up, Bobby, you won't have any friends." And he said in front of the crowd, he said, I told him, I have a lot of friends. And I thought that was very effective, because one of the things you would hear in Washington and Wall Street all the time was, if you buck us on this one, you won't have any friends. I can't tell you what a great, effective threat that always was, to sort of corral and herd the troops. And I thought the way he sort of teed that up and killed it was beautiful, but you could feel the chilling coercion that comes with these efforts.
So what has happened? Yes. I mean, I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the chair of Children's Health Defense, has been just an extraordinary gift to the parental community that wants to have their own informed consent over what goes into their children's bodies. He's been, outspoken, and he doesn't pull punches, right? He's been really explicit in the fraud that's involved in this, and in essence the heist of health and the heist of money from families around this vaccine program. But I think on the friends issue, it's fascinating. So what we saw in New Jersey, for instance, is there's a very dominant president of the Senate, and we watched twice in December and January as he tried to browbeat junior Democrats and threatened to punish them if they voted against the party's decision to repeal the religious exemption. And after it didn't pass the second time, he in fact took away the chairmanship of the Judiciary Committee from Senator Lagana, who voted against him as a Democrat.
Wow.
And they tried to enforce other penalties against their party members who did not toe the line. So much for sort of legislators being able to vote their conscience. They're not when it comes to a party priority, and they're punished if they vote their conscience or they vote the way their constituents really require them to vote. But what was very interesting in New Jersey, Catherine, is that the Democratic legislators who voted against the bill, the Democrats, with one exception, with maybe a couple exceptions, but several of them were African American. And what we're seeing now is that African American legislators have a better understanding of this often than the sort of mainstream or Caucasian legislators. The African Americans understand is like, if you're going to start throwing children out of school and segregating them on this basis, where is that going to stop? And isn't this the same rhetoric that they used against Jews and against African Americans? They're dirty, they're diseased, they're, vermin. And we see all of that stigmatization going on. I was with a mom the other day whose children have been thrown out of a religious school, a Catholic school. And, the school administrators are saying, they have to fumigate the school if she were to come. I mean, really treating these people as if they are walking disease spreaders, which is so ironic, because in truth, the unvaccinated are the healthiest among us. They have fully intact immune systems that work the way our Creator, made them.
So I want to talk a little bit about money now, because I have worked through with numerous families the cost of having anywhere from a mildly autistic to heavily autistic child,
Mm-hmm.
and not just the economics of what it's going to cost them in times and money,
Mm-hmm.
but in fact what it costs the other siblings, what it costs
Right.
in terms of divorce and impact
Right.
on the family.
Right.
So the financial expense to the family is extraordinary to everybody in the family, and often the extended family, and yet there doesn't seem to be there seems to be a complete disinterest from the companies, the legislators promoting this. In other words, the pharmaceutical companies get the profits, the government gets the profits, but the families and the neighbors and the extended family get the expenses.
Well, I don't even think, I think that the state governments are saddling the costs, right? So we have this federal injury compensation program that Congress created in 1986. And in theory, it's going to cover the expenses of people who are injured by vaccines. But there's a very short statute of limitations. It's very limited what they actually, will compensate. And, 2/3 of the cases lose. There's an extraordinary range of things that are wrong with that program. But then the states, through Medicaid, are saddled with these expenses. And if you read about what's
Right.
going on with schools and special education now, I mean, it's unbelievable, right? I mean, there's padded rooms and there's special classes. I was just reading about the school district where I went, and they said when I was there, maybe there was like one special needs classroom out of 1,600 children. There were 6, and they say that now they need 13. I mean, 13 special needs classrooms. This is an extraordinary expense to the educational system. And then the tidal wave that's coming, that the states are completely unprepared for, right? Since 1989, when the vaccine program really started to ramp up after the liability protection was put in place, those people are now just hitting adulthood. And as you point out, their life care plans are millions of dollars, and states and families, of course, in the first instance, and charities. But beyond that, it's the state. And honestly, I don't know what's going to happen, because many of these young adults are now severely, severely injured. They're nonverbal. Many
Right.
of them are not potty trained. Many of them are violent. That's part of the neurological injury. And it's very, many of them require 24/7 care. And unless we stop this craziness and keep injuring people, I don't know what's going to happen, Catherine. I mean, I do lose sleep over it. It's like, how is the society going to cope? It's a very frightening thought. It's a very frightening thought. And when you see that we're violating Nuremberg, and then you remember that where the Holocaust really started was killing special needs children. German children is where it started. They started by killing special needs German
Right.
children. It's a very chilling thought. There are some very uncomfortable parallels right now between what's happening in the US around medicine and what happened in Germany before, when the Nazis were taking over. The medical community collaborated. And I'm very frightened, because we have a percentage of adults coming of age we have a much higher percentage of adults coming of age who will not be able to support themselves or contribute to the society in a financial way.
Right. And I think it's not just kids who are heavily autistic and so can't be productive in the workplace, but when you look at the numbers of 60+% children with chronic disease, you're talking about a highly unproductive group of people.
Correct.
With tremendous stress on the healthcare system. If you look at the cost, we cost more per person, almost double than the next.
Right. Now,
the next most expensive country, I think, which is Switzerland. So, and that's before this sort of bulge moves through moves through the age group.
Exactly. It's really, truly frightening. One of the people who's now consulting with Children's Health Defense is named Toby Rogers, and he just completed a PhD in Australia on the political economy of autism. And he was just on Del Bigtree's Highwire reviewing the actual costs of autism. But of course, vaccine injury is so much broader than just autism. That's literally the tip of the iceberg.
Right.
It is the ADHD.
Right.
It is the juvenile arthritis. It is the juvenile diabetes. It is, by far, it is the asthma. It is so broad of the things that are likely connected to vaccines that have, where the connection has been obscured.
Right. And then all the opportunity costs to the family when those things occur within it.
Oh, yeah.
So let's talk about what people can do to help, because I think there are many different actions that someone can take. The first, and I think, is to keep the revenues flowing. I always say, I'm always quoting Roger Penske, speed costs money, how fast do you want to go? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the extent to which we're all financing the lobbyists and law firms and companies and governments that are doing this, I think part of it, I believe, is we need to start switching our cash flows to the people who are truly representing us. So one thing they can do is to support you. We regularly give little donations and publicize them on the blog, and your group is always at the top of the list.
Thank you.
But I would encourage everybody to go to childrenshealthdefense.org and and sign up, make a donation. What else can they do to support?
Well, we're an educational institution. We don't officially take positions on any bills. We support people to make informed health choices, but we provide a lot of information about vaccines. We're getting more generally involved in other threats to childhood and human health, including the wireless industry and health effects of that, glyphosate, pesticides in food. We're getting involved more broadly, but the vaccines has really been our focus, in part because most other institutions aren't willing to take that on. But the other things people can do is every state at this point has a health choice organization. Scour Facebook, look on the internet. You'll find that there is a group in your state. We're starting to form state chapters, but we only have a few. There are some what's called health choice state chapters. You can look at the health choice. National Vaccine Information Center also has state chapters effectively and leaders. The National Vaccine Information Center has a legislative portal, which is very useful. And you go into the portal and you find out what are the pending bills in your state that have implications for vaccines. And it tells you whether they recommend that you support it or oppose it, as somebody who's concerned about informed consent for vaccines. You want to give some love to the politicians who are taking your position. We're seeing that now more. It's very important that if you see a politician who's standing up and says, I support informed consent, I support parental rights, I support bodily integrity around these issues, we need to support those people, because it does take effort and courage for them to stand up against the pharmaceutical industry. And basically, they're not going to get funded, and their own party may be up against them. And other things people can do, so literally what happened in New Jersey is just thousands of parents converged, and they made it clear, we won't accept this. We will vote you out. One of our chants was, we will vote you out.
So this is a campaign year. So many politicians have campaigns this year. And I find showing up at the town hall meeting and making your voice heard about this and making it clear that you will not tolerate violations of the Nuremberg Code is, to me, is very, very important.
It is very important. And I think really letting legislators know, I, in general, am not a one-issue voter, but on this, I'm a one-issue voter. You may not you may not separate me from my child. You may not deprive me and my child of our independent healthcare decision-making. It's so fundamental. It's like, if they can force you to inject aluminum in your body to go to school, well, how are you going to know what's in that particular vial? You're not going to know.
Right.
It's really an extraordinary overreach, governmental overreach.
So to me, I'll be even stronger, because it is health freedom, but it's freedom. In other words,
it's freedom. I agree with you.
Is my body my own? Is my house my own?
Absolutely.
If my body's not mine, there are no property rights at all.
I completely agree. And it's interesting. One of the legislators in New Jersey made the point. He's a criminal defense lawyer, and he said, if there is if there's a homicide, if there's an accident driving, and potentially a drunk driver kills somebody else on the road, so it's called vehicular homicide. In that circumstance, to get a blood test from that person to quote unquote pierce the skin requires a warrant from a judge. That requires real due process to get that. And yet our children are lined up as if this was Kool-Aid. It's not Kool-Aid. And I agree with you. If you don't control your own body, you don't control anything.
Right. Right. Especially if somebody's putting in things which have been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt to be very
proven
dangerous.
to be toxic, right. Proven to be dangerous.
So one last thing, Mary, because I know from understanding and reading your history, what I call it, the shriekometer. There is whether it's the lobbyists or the media, there is a bullying culture and mentality in this country when people are politically trying to force something which is contradictory to our basic principles. So you really have to go up against quite a machinery of lies and spin. Right. And yet you have done this for decades very, very effectively, and you seem not the worse for wear. So how do we deal with that kind of bullying?
Honestly, one of the ways I deal with it is I don't go out of my way to make myself aware of all the bullying. If somebody writes a nasty piece about me, my friends will tell me, and maybe I'll go read the really nasty piece. But, the day-to-day sort of harassment that happens on Twitter and on, the internet, I don't read those things. I find that they're drivel to me. It's just talking points from the industry, and I don't waste my time on it. And that protects me, candidly. I don't really need to know what Orak has to say, or what Gorski has to say on a regular basis, or what Dorit Rice says. Sometimes I think they're interesting points, or Art Kaplan, but basically I see those people as spokespeople for industry, and I know what their talking points are. I'm not going to I'm not going to envelop myself in what is really, it's vitriol. It's toxic, and I do avoid it personally. And I do have lots of friends. It's an extraordinary movement, I have to say. It's a really profound movement to me, because I can disagree with many, many people in this movement on many, many issues. But on this issue, we are just there's such solidarity. It's like, there's nothing our species is named after the relationship between a mother and a child. It's a mammal, right? It's the act of breastfeeding. It's like, if you cast asunder the relationship between a parent and a child, it's all over. That's what the species is about. And so on this issue, I don't care if I disagree with people about 1,000 other issues. I am so delighted to stand in solidarity with that parent on this issue. And there's something so beautiful about people protecting their children. That's what this is really about.
Well, here's the thing. I mean, it gets back to every value that you've ever been taught was representative of Western values. If we're going to have vaccine mandates throughout the United States, then there is no such thing as Western values. We've just taken all of them and deleted them.
I think that the only thing that made the vaccine mandates arguably legitimate for the last 50 years was the existence of religious exemptions. Taking them away makes these mandates absolutely, uncontrovertibly an abuse of power. Right.
And a change of, to me, it's a change of your entire governance structure and system.
This is not.
You're not a constitutional republic.
I agree. This is not freedom. If you don't control what goes into your bloodstream, you are not free. It is far broader than health freedom. It is freedom itself.
Right. And as you said, this is We're talking about heavy metals that go straight to the brain. We're not talking about
Right.
Kool-Aid.
Right. We know that, there are things in the vaccines that cross the blood-brain barrier. And we know from autopsies that people who are severely autistic, for example, have high concentrations of aluminum in the brain. We know so much now, Catherine. This is not 150 years ago. And we have so many other ways to deal with measles, with vitamin A, or to get through a rash with the mumps. This is just so crazy. These are essentially mild childhood illnesses. There's so much evidence that, for instance, it is the vaccinated with pertussis who are transmitting and causing the outbreaks. We have the evidence that the mumps component doesn't work. That's why we're seeing outbreaks in fully vaccinated populations. Measles is, we know that the vaccine is not entirely affected. We know that some people aren't going to get immunity. We know that there's asymptomatic transmission. We know so much more than we knew in the past that it makes it just, this is an unsustainable program. And really the question in my mind is, how long is it going to take for us to end it? That's really the question. The writing's on the wall. I lived through the end of the Soviet Union and the collapse of the Berlin Wall. This is a system that doesn't work. It's going to fall apart. The only question is, how long is it going to take?
Right. I agree with you. There was, I just did a book review about a year ago of a book, I think it was called The Autism Vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Is it the Autism Project or the Autism Vaccine?
I don't know that one.
I have to look it up. It's quite extraordinary because it was the only vaccine book I've ever read that had no anger in it. It was very peacefully done.
Mm-hmm.
Let me see if I can find it. And it was beautifully written.
Oh,
just
great.
Extraordinary. Wait a minute. Let me see. And, but the way it ended up, let me just get it. It was the autism vaccine by The Story of Modern Medicine's Greatest Tragedy. It's by Forrest. He's
Forrest
a science
McGreedy.
Writer.
Forrest Moridi.
Moridi.
Yeah, he's an excellent
writer. He's the author
writer.
of The Moth and the Iron Lung and Crook. Yeah.
Yeah, super.
Beautiful,
super.
beautiful book.
Oh, good. I'll read it.
Oh, but what it makes clear at the end is that it's almost as though it took forever to start the storm, but now you have this storm of parents and practitioners who cannot be stopped.
Right. Right.
And he says the same thing you say. It's simply a matter of time, because this will not last.
This will not blow over.
Right. It reminds me, have you ever heard the story of the island of California, the map of the island of California?
No.
You can look it up on the internet. In the 1500s, someone made a map of the west coast of the United States, and they made California an island that you could sail around. Clearly the map was wrong. Mm-hmm. And it became essentially the official map of the Spanish explorers. And everybody insisted that they had sailed around the Isle of California. Of course, they were lying. But you had all these famous explorers who were then committed to the lie. And finally, it took the king.
Wow.
So many people were landing and then trying to carry their boats over the mountains so they could sail across the Bay of California, which of course didn't exist anyway. But it took an act of the king to say, kill the map.
Wow.
Because so many people were caught up in the lies.
Yeah. There's a lot of people caught up in this lie.
If there is anything that the Solari Report or I or the Solari team or our subscribers can do to help, we definitely would love to do it, and especially state by state. If I'll tell people to look at where you have chapters, or the other organization that has local chapters is called Health Choice.
Health Choice has many state chapters. They're an excellent group. I'm on their advisory board. But I'm happy to stay in touch with you. Right now, the state that's really under the microscope is Connecticut. So the festivities start in Connecticut tomorrow. And so that's the state right now to watch. Although New Jersey and New York are still sort of very much in play, what's going to happen for the remainder of the legislative season. And then there's this referendum in Maine coming up. Those are some of the key things that are going on legislatively right now.
Okay, well, Mary, you're doing great stuff, and we look forward to keeping up with you and supporting. And I just say thank you.
Thank you, Catherine.
You're
Thank
doing
you.
you're doing something that's important to every person, whether because this is health freedom and this is freedom. So
This is about freedom.
Yep.
May I ask
exactly.
a question? Will I be able to get a link to this? Is that possible? Can we publicize the interview?
And if you would
no?
like, normally our interviews are subscriber only, but if we think
Right.
there's an important public purpose, we'll make it public. And if you would like, I'll make this public right away.
I think we would love that, and we'll put it, and then we'll attract people. If you give us a blurb about how people can join to be a subscriber, we'll be happy to. Well, I don't know. I have to ask with my media team, but we could probably at least give you credit for it.
Don't worry about that. We'll make it public, and we'll
and then we can link to it. Well, that'd be super.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm grateful to have had the chance to speak.
Okay, and you're right. I bet you do have a lot of friends.
We do.
You have a great day.
Thank you. You too.